Okay, so today let's kind of dive into something that's been really interesting me lately, and that's British politeness,
Okay.
which I think we've all heard the stereotypes about, right? All
Yeah.
the pleases and thank yous and apologies. But like we always say on the show, there's often way more to it than just what you see on the surface.
Yeah, definitely.
And that's what we're going to be looking at today in this deep dive.
Absolutely.
And to do that, we've got these excerpts from this really interesting text that's all about British manners. And I was reading through it before, and it's not just like your grandma's etiquette guide. Like, it really gets into the nitty-gritty of why Brits do politeness the way they do.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
So I'm really interested to kind of get into it.
Yeah, one of the key things is this whole concept of negative politeness.
Negative politeness.
Yeah.
What is that? That sounds like it's not a good thing.
Yeah, it sounds a bit counterintuitive, but it's not being rude or anything. It's more about this whole minimizing, imposing on other people, that kind of thing.
Right.
So prioritizing other people's space, their autonomy,
I see.
not wanting to kind of metaphorically or literally step on anyone's toes.
Okay, I think I'm starting to get it. So it's less about like showering people with compliments and more about just giving them space.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's creating that kind of like distance and respect, which is very inherent in British culture.
Okay.
Yeah.
So like all those pleases and thank yous and sorries are like little buffers.
Exactly. Yeah. Little tiny little breathing spaces in a conversation.
Fascinating. So is that like, where did this come from? Did it just appear one day, this negative politeness?
Well, no, not quite.
Okay.
I think to understand it, we have to kind of go back in time a little bit.
Okay.
Imagine, if you will, medieval England.
Okay.
So courtesy, as it was known back then,
Right.
which I guess you could say is like politeness's ancestor.
Okay.
That was all the rage in the royal court, you know?
Ah, so it all started with the fancy people.
It did. It did. And it was a way of them showing off their status, showing their refinement.
Okay.
And that kind of trickled down over time. And it's influenced how everyone in all the different classes, how they behave.
So instead of barking orders at people, they were like using flowery language and bowing to each other.
Well, yeah, you get the idea.
Yeah.
But I think as well as that historical influence, you've also got to think about Britain and its class system.
Right.
It's always had a very strong class system. Yeah.
So for centuries, it wasn't even just about being polite. It was navigating this social minefield.
Right, like one wrong move and you're out.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
It was a tool to kind of climb the social ladder, or at least not say the wrong thing that could damage your reputation.
So how did that actually play out? Were there like secret handshakes for the different classes?
Not quite, but there were definitely these subtle cues and these codes of conduct.
Right.
So for instance, you've got the upper classes, they'd often use more formal language,
Okay.
pepper their speech with like terribly sorry or most kind.
Right.
They even had like different words for things. Like instead of saying toilet, they'd say lavatory, that kind of thing.
Fancy.
It's all to kind of signal what their social standing was.
It's like a secret language, but with how you hold your teacup. Pretty much, pretty much. And then you've got the middle class. They were kind of like chameleons of courtesy.
Okay.
They could change how they speak depending on who they were talking to. So they could slip into slang with friends, but then they'd be more polished if they were in a professional setting.
Right, you got to be adaptable.
Exactly.
Yeah, so what about the working class? Where do they fit into all this?
Well, working class politeness was often really direct.
Okay.
It was characterized by its regional variation. So you've got those really charming regional accents and phrases.
All right.
They valued sincerity. They valued straight talking.
Yeah.
And their politeness reflected that.
So even though there were all these differences, there was still this underlying current of British politeness that connected them all.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
And this is where it gets even more interesting because British politeness, it wasn't confined to just England, was it?
Right, the British Empire.
Exactly.
They were everywhere.
Yeah. So suddenly they're having to put their politeness to the test.
Yeah.
They were coming across all these different customs and traditions.
Right.
And this really emphasized the importance of tact and diplomacy.
Yeah, so it's like, okay, we need a universal language to make this whole empire thing work, and we're going to use politeness.
Pretty much. Pretty much. It was
Right.
their way of kind of navigating this new globalized world.
Right?
And that's where I think even the English language itself comes into play as well.
Right, all those roundabout ways of saying things.
Exactly. It's amazing. English has this incredible ability to express a whole spectrum of politeness, from being really direct to being incredibly subtle.
And we can't forget about the British love of self-deprecation, can we?
Ah, yes, the art of being understated.
Always downplaying everything, any achievement.
It's all part of this, like, maintaining the social harmony.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So British politeness really is this mix of all this history, all this social dynamics, even the language itself.
Absolutely.
It's like a fingerprint.
Yeah. And I think even though the specific rules and the customs might have changed over time, that core value of courtesy is still very much there in Britain today.
I'm ready to get into even more. So what else can you tell us about how this all plays out in modern Britain?
You know, it's funny, isn't it? We're talking about a culture that's so associated with being polite, but at the same time, you've got this tension between tradition and, well, being modern.
Yeah,
And that plays out in how people interact every day.
right. Like how do you square those older ideas about being courteous with, living in today's world? The two don't really seem to go together, do they?
Exactly. And it's particularly interesting when you think about class as well.
Right.
Remember we were talking about negative politeness?
Yeah, minimizing, imposing.
Yeah, well, that plays out in really interesting ways in modern Britain because, for example, this text mentions some research that's found that working class people are sometimes less likely to use apologies in that negative politeness way than, say, middle or upper class people.
Oh, really? That's interesting. Why do you think that is?
Well, one theory is it's about the kind of work they do and how they communicate every day.
Oh, that makes sense.
So, for example, if you're in a job where you need to be really clear and direct with what you're saying, maybe you're less likely to use those sorts of like softening apologies.
All about context.
Exactly. But then there's another thing to think about too, which is the whole digital age.
Right.
How does this emphasis on politeness, whether it's negative or any other type, how does that work online, do you think?
That's such a good question. I mean, the internet can be a bit of a free-for-all, can it? Not exactly known for being polite.
True, but even online you see these fascinating kind of like echoes of traditional British politeness.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, think about online forums, those sorts of things. Have you ever noticed how even when people are really disagreeing with each other, they often still try and be quite civil about it? Maybe they'll use humor to like diffuse the tension, or they'll frame their criticism more indirectly.
Actually, yeah, now that you mention it, you do see that.
Yeah.
It's like they're taking these centuries-old rules of etiquette and trying to make them work online.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to apply them to this new digital world.
It's so interesting, but I do wonder, with there's so much communication happening online these days, are we losing those sort of like subtleties that you get in face-to-face interactions?
Yeah.
Like the tone of voice, body language, all of that.
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And there's not an easy answer, I don't think. Like, on the one hand, you could argue that the digital world is definitely stripping some of that nuance away. But then on the other hand, maybe it's actually forcing us to find new ways of expressing those things.
Good point.
So, maybe a well-placed emoji is the new way of saying terribly sorry.
The sorry emoji, I like.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But actually, speaking of sorry, let's talk about that a bit more because that's maybe the most well-known aspect of British politeness, that constant apologizing.
Right. Everyone always says that Brits apologize for everything. Is it really true?
Yeah. Is it true? Well, interestingly, this text mentions some research about this, and apparently, while Brits may not actually apologize more often than people from other cultures, it's more about when they say it.
So it's not just an automatic response to like any little thing.
Well, sometimes it is. But the interesting thing is, sorry can have lots of different functions in British English.
Like what?
So, for instance, people might say sorry just to get someone's attention or to kind of preface a disagreement or even just to express sympathy.
So it's less about admitting they did something wrong and more about navigating social situations.
Exactly. It's like a social lubricant in a way. It smooths over any awkwardness.
Makes sense.
And again, it goes back to that negative politeness.
Right.
Trying to avoid causing offense.
Yeah, so rather than just like interrupting someone, they'll
Yeah.
say sorry just to show they're there, which is actually quite considerate when you think about it.
Exactly. It's all about that social harmony thing we were talking about, very important in British culture.
Yeah, it's been so interesting. All of this, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. Every layer, there's something new to discover.
I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And speaking of layers, I think it's worth looking at the historical evolution of all of this in a bit more detail as well, because I think that can tell us even more.
Yeah, definitely lead the way.
So, if you can rewind with me all the way back to medieval times,
Okay.
courtesy, as it was known back then, which, as we've said, is sort of the ancestor of modern politeness, it wasn't just about saying please and thank you.
Right.
It was all bound up with ideas of chivalry and honor and this very rigid social structure.
So less about polite conversation, more about knights in shining armor then.
Pretty much, yeah. So courtesy was a way of demonstrating your loyalty, your position in society, showing that you knew the rules and how to behave.
So it's almost like a social currency then, right?
Yeah.
If you can show you're courteous, then you're in with the in crowd.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that idea of courtesy being linked to your place in society, well, it didn't just vanish overnight, did it?
No.
So fast forward a bit to the 18th century, the Enlightenment,
Right.
when everyone's supposed to be all about reason and progress. But even then, courtesy, it was still a big deal.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, the era of powdered wigs and witty comebacks. I can imagine all those drawing room conversations where people are just desperately trying to outdo each other with how polite they could be.
Yeah, it really was a social game, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You were expected to be charming and clever with your words. You had to know all about the right things.
So basically, if you wanted to get anywhere in life, you had to be polite.
Pretty much. But then along comes the Industrial Revolution.
Oh, yeah?
Factories everywhere. Suddenly things are being mass produced.
Right.
And a whole new class of people have got money, these industrialists.
And they wanted to get in on the act as well, didn't they?
Exactly. And suddenly etiquette books, they were everywhere.
Everyone wanted to know the rules.
Everyone wanted to know how to fit in, how to behave, how to have dinner with the right people.
So it's like those old ideas about courtesy, they were being like reinvented for a new generation.
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've been talking about British politeness specifically, but it's obviously a much bigger thing than that.
Well, for sure.
I mean, this idea of trying to be courteous, thinking about how you interact with people, trying to be respectful, it's not just a British thing, is it?
No, absolutely not. And I guess what's considered polite in one culture could be completely different somewhere else.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And nowadays, what with globalization and everyone online, we're all having to navigate all these different ways of interacting way more than we used to.
So how do we manage that then when there are so many different expectations?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I think a lot of it comes down to just being aware of those differences to begin with, being willing to learn and adapt.
Yeah, that
And maybe, just maybe, the most important thing is to remember those really basic things like being respectful and having empathy. I think they're at the heart of what it means to be polite, wherever you are in the world.
Yeah, I think you're right, because when it comes down to it, isn't that what politeness is all about, really? It's about making other people feel good, making them feel respected.
Absolutely. It's about trying to find that common ground.
Well said. I've really enjoyed today's deep dive.
Me too.
We've gone from knights in shining armor to emojis. It's been quite a journey.
It has.
But before we go, I want to leave our listeners with something to think about. We've talked about how politeness has changed and evolved over time, but what about the future? You know, technology is changing how we communicate all the time, so what does that mean for politeness? Where do we go next?
That's such a good question. I mean, it really feels like we're in this completely new territory, doesn't it? Trying to figure out how to be polite in this digital age.
It does, and who knows? Maybe the next evolution of politeness is just one tweet away. And on that note, dear listener, we'll lead you to ponder all of that. Until next time, keep those conversations flowing, keep those minds curious, and remember, a little kindness goes a long way no matter how you choose to express it.